Rocker sisters and brothers, it's Elizabeth, and I am really looking forward to sharing with you Mary Giuliani today, who is an author. One of her most recent book is, it's not about food, drugs, or alcohol. It's about healing complex PTSD. It's so interesting to me because, well, for a number of reasons. Because frankly, I've struggled a lot with health and weight issues, but also as I'm writing Grounded in Grit and just recorded a whole chapter on this very topic, that we need to look deeper than our habits to figure out where they came from, and looking, kind of taking an inventory as to what contributes to some of the things that we go through day to day is really, really important. Looking at things like adverse childhood experiences study. If you've been listening to the podcast for a little while now, and hey, you have more than 100 backlist episodes, if this is your first time, then you know that we talk about healing trauma and a lot of resilience. And so Mary's very timely. There was a study done so long ago, and I would just, without belaboring the point, encourage you to look at it, called ACEs.org, ACES.org. And I think that if it's not there, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, has a copy of the ACEs quiz. It asks about some really toxic traumas that sometimes we go through as young kids and we don't even think about how they may impact us later. So we'll unpack that in this interview. It's a beautiful sunny day today where I'm at in Tennessee. It's still brisk outside. By the time you listen to this, frankly, it could be deep in summer because we've got a lot of episodes in the queue. But right now we're just into spring. My youngest daughter is having a birthday tomorrow. Other updates besides the writing is, thank you, Gary, to be my first patron. If any of you are interested in helping support the podcast and or my writing and want to have a little more connection, I have a Patreon page where a person for $2 to $5 a month can support and also get access to some of my reading earlier than other people do, as well as some workshops that may be relevant to you. So I'm excited. I'm really excited. I am guilty of having so many things in the works that I forget to promote them. And so to have my first patron was like a huge breakthrough. Appreciate it, because again, it's kind of like you listening to the podcast. It shows that you're interested. And when you share an episode or review it or support in any way, I am truly, truly grateful. I think it costs about at least $200 a month to run a podcast on the software that I'm using and to do the work that I'm doing. And that doesn't account for my unpaid time, which is a lot. So it is great to recompense some of that. And yay, really makes me feel great. So looking forward to having Mary, looking forward to have Grounded in Grit, Turn Your Challenges into Superpowers, published soon. And also just really excited about more sun, more light, less struggle with getting myself motivated to get out of bed, and all the things. If you're not already, join me at lameredith.com and hop onto my email list, where I email a couple of times to 4 times a month, short emails that are newsy and fun. Thanks always for being here. Appreciate you very, very much. And on we go with Mary. In just a second, I'll bring her to you. Mary, welcome so much to Persistence U. I really appreciate you taking the time today.
You are so welcome. I'm thrilled to be here.
I'm thrilled. And I gave you the introduction about your most recent book, but I didn't talk a lot about how, your story and how it all began to where you wrote this most recent book. So can you tell us a little bit about you? And also, did I say your name? I pronounced it as Giuliani.
Correct.
Okay. And there's another author with your name. So we need to differentiate you with that person.
Mary, well, Well, there's a woman that's a caterer in New York that
I'll be darned. Yeah. Well, we want
Yeah.
people to enjoy that caterer, but not to
Yeah.
get you mixed up. So yes, very. So
Yeah.
anyway, thank you for being here. And can you tell us just the backstory about how you learned about complex trauma and began to write the book that you did?
Sure. Well, I had been on a 30-year healing and recovery path. So I'd gotten sober when I was 27, stopped drinking, stopped smoking pot, stopped smoking cigarettes. And I got into recovery I also had a severe obesity problem and food addiction. And so I went to OA and lost a bunch of weight. And so I was really like dedicated to my recovery. And I also had become a life coach in my 30s. And the background, and I'll go into a little bit deeper further on, but is I was raised in a pretty dysfunctional alcoholic home. So anyway, I'd been doing all this healing work on healing the wounds of my past and my family of origin stuff and codependency. And, so I've been like an avid reader and, really have my nose to the ground on everything related to personal growth, especially when it comes to healing wounds from being raised in dysfunctional families. So when I was 57 years old, 5 years ago, I came across a book about childhood trauma. And the only reason I bought the book was because I'd seen the topic of trauma coming up in best-selling lists and stuff like that. And since I'm a total psychology geek, I'm like, well, I keep on hearing this thing about trauma, but I've never, I never thought it would apply to me.
Right.
Because I didn't have physical or sexual abuse. And so, being the total psychology geek I am, I'm like, I want to read this book. And it had really good reviews. And it is called The Body Keeps the Score, The Brain, Body, and Mind in Healing of Trauma by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. So I get it on Audible, I'm listening away. And I mean, within the first, I don't know, maybe 30 minutes, and this is like a 16-hour audiobook, I'm like, oh my God, the symptoms he's talking about are me.
Right.
And I'm
Wow.
like, oh my God. So you don't have to experience physical or sexual abuse or something really horrible or horrific
Right.
to actually have childhood trauma. And so I'm like having these epiphanies of like, oh my God. So, and not only that, I didn't know about, when I thought about childhood trauma, I thought, okay, well, it's a severe, psychological issue that can probably be, managed or treated with therapy and meds or something. But I had no idea that it actually changes the developing brain of a child,
Right,
and their nervous system and their body and their worldview and their ability to have close relationships, because the essence of childhood trauma it's also known as relational trauma. And so all of a sudden, all of these pieces start falling into place about my life. Like, oh, well, no wonder I've had difficulty forming or maintaining close relationships. Like, I always had friends and stuff like that, but it
right.
seemed like over a course of several years, something would come up and it would bug me, but I didn't have the ability to confront it. And so I would end these slowly kind of pull away from friendships, and I'd find myself without any friends. And it would be baffling to me because it was like, I really like friends, but I don't know what's going on with me. Well, I learned that with relational trauma, you actually have a trauma response when you're confronted with uncomfortable things that remind you of whatever went on with your family dynamics. And it's unless you get into a healing, it's going to be very difficult for you to deal with that. And so that's why so many trauma survivors have difficulty either forming or maintaining long-term friendships or healthy romantic relationships. The other thing that blew my mind is I'm reading, listening to this book, and I'm like, well, no wonder I had difficulty focusing in school. And because what happens with childhood trauma is the front part of the brain, which is what called the prefrontal cortex, which is in charge of focus and emotional regulation and impulse control, underdevelops because the fight, flight, freeze, which is the back part survival brain, has to overdevelop to deal with the insanity in your house. And so how that shows up for kids is difficulty focusing, also difficulty with impulse control. And so I started using food when I was 5 years old because of the tension I felt between my parents. And my dad used food. So, it was modeled and it was the most easy thing available. And it gave me a sense of soothing and, comfort when I didn't know what to do with
Right.
my feelings. So I started gaining weight when I was like 6, 7, and started getting bullied about it at school. And then my mom started drinking alcoholically when I was about 8 or 9. And then all of this rage of her screaming at my dad started, and that went on for about 10 years, keeping my sister and I up, we couldn't sleep at night. And um, so my weight kept on escalating. And then by the time I was 16, the first time I had a drink, and I even knew that I was at risk for alcoholism, but I was at a party and there was beers and stuff. And so I drank down half of a beer, and it was like this ripple of well-being that
Oh no.
came over me
Right.
of, oh
Oh
my God,
dear.
this is really awesome. And so then
Right.
I had another one, and I'm telling you, it was like an elixir sent down from the gods. It was that powerful. It was like a peak experience. And there was pot there too. So I tried that. And it was like, given the hell I'd gone through for 10 years at home with my family. And by that time I had lost a bunch of weight with this crazy weight loss thing I did. So I felt good about how I looked, but it was still insane at home with my mom's drinking and everything.
Mhm.
And it was like, I'm going to get that feeling back again. I've got to. And so I just figured out a way to find people I could, get pot and alcohol with, and off to the races I was with my own issues with drugs and alcohol, and still binge, and then eventually I lost like 80 pounds over the summer of my freshman year in high school.
Wow, that's a lot.
But once I, started drinking and, beers, all the beer I did, and I was still binge eating. So by the time I was, 26, when I finally got sober, I was like almost 300 pounds. So here I was, in this horribly destructive pattern that I felt powerless to stop. And I had no idea that my brain and body and mind had been changed because of trauma. And what I learned in this book, Body Keeps the Score, is that I didn't ask to be traumatized. And so,
Mhm.
and not everybody that goes through trauma develops addictions. However, everyone that goes through trauma develops a way to adapt, because we have to, whether it's shutting
Mhm.
down, dissociating, becoming extremely busy or focused, or caretaking other people, or whatever it is. A child will have to find a way to adapt to the discomfort of what they call dysregulated nervous system. Dysregulated means you're either anxious, uncomfortable, fearful, or the opposite, lethargic, shut down, just want to stay in bed, that kind of thing. So again, I didn't know that all of these things had impacted me. And also the impulse control deficits are, these are proven scientific facts, that kids that have experienced childhood trauma, that part of your brain does not develop to the level of kids that don't. And so, for me, when I was growing up and dealing with my food stuff, I didn't have that capacity to say no to myself when I wasn't really hungry, because I just wanted to soothe the pain of the hell I was going through watching my mom being decimated by alcoholism, my family being crazy, and my own shame for just dealing with being bullied and being fat. And so anyway, I'm reading this book and I'm just having epiphany after epiphany. And at first it was like, oh my God. And by the way, so I was 57 when I found out about this. And so I had been sober for many decades, but I was still struggling. And I actually had been maintaining a healthy weight too. So, but I was still struggling with food to some degree. I was definitely struggling with caffeine. I was struggling with sleeping without meds, and with close relationships. And so even though I had curtailed these more overt symptoms, I was still suffering with these other symptoms. But the one symptom that was left over from the addiction was I still had deep shame about it. So I didn't want anyone else to know. Like, for example, once I lost my weight and felt like I looked normal, I was a life coach. So the last thing, I mean, I felt like I was sick of feeling bad about myself and how I looked and my history of severe addiction and obesity. And so when I started working as a coach, I didn't want anyone to know about my history. I didn't want you to know that I used to weigh over 300 pounds. I didn't want you to know I drank over a 12-pack of beer a day and smoked cigarettes and did drugs and, all those things, because I still had so much shame, because on a deep level, I felt like it meant I was weak, I was a failure, and I was broken, and that they just wouldn't have respect for me. So I had kept it hidden. But once I learned that these alcohol, drug problems, obesity, severe obesity, these are like the smoke. These are symptoms. The fire is what drives them, which is the pain, the emotional pain, and the discomfort and the anxiety of unresolved trauma. So once I learned it wasn't my fault, it was like this huge relief of like, oh my God, I'm not bad, I'm not broken, I'm not weak, I'm not a bad person or undesirable because of this. I was simply traumatized.
Right.
And and that there are trauma-based solutions that I can access to heal. And that was the other key piece, is I got to the point in the book where Bessel Kolk says, no amount of talk therapy can completely heal trauma. And I'm like, because the only thing I'd done was talk therapy over the past 30 years and make 12-step and just other personal growth groups and self-help books. So I'm like, so you're telling me for the past 30 years, I could have been accessing the specific types of body-brain trauma-based therapies to help me heal, but I didn't know about them because none of the dozens of therapists I'd gone to ever even thought to think that I could be suffering from trauma. And so that was a whole other layer of anger. And, like, if I would have known like 10 years ago, I could have let go of a lot of shame. I could have gotten into more trauma-based therapies that help heal the body, brain, nervous system, as well as the mind.
Right.
So, it was a mixed bag, but it was huge. And that's what made me want to write the book. It was like, there's got to be millions, if not billions, of people out there that are suffering from these symptoms that have no idea that it's not their fault, they're not bad or broken, and that with the right types of support, they can heal. And so that's what drove me to write the book.
Well, that's excellent. It sounds like you were treating each thing like an individual problem that you were just hitting down with a mallet, and kind of like a whack-a-mole, each little addiction would come up and you're hitting it. But then you realized that underneath it all was one similar a similar theme. The adverse childhood experiences study that you're talking about, we talk about the fact that, a lot of kids will go through a trauma and they respond differently. But if there are too many toxic traumas that kind of double up on children, if it's too much, too long,
not enough support.
In the right circumstances, it is life altering, and it isn't fixable, quote unquote. It's, you can do healing work and all of that, but we're not going to make it's not going to be erased necessarily. But some of those toxic traumas, as you learned about them, what are some of the on the ACEs study that you wouldn't have thought?
Right. So just for people that might not know, the ACE study asks 10 questions of whether you experience these certain things before you were 18 growing up. And I have 6 of the 10. And anyway, so the first one is being raised in an alcoholic or a drug addicted home, being raised by a parent that has mental health issues, including anxiety and depression, being raised where you witness domestic violence, also where a parent is incarcerated, where there's emotional abuse or emotional neglect, which means that your feelings are not validated or considered, even like valuable, where you experience sexual abuse or physical abuse. I don't know if I covered.
You've got the majority of it. And I know that some has been added on to a newer, because there are issues of racism that now we're factoring in, and things that weren't initially brought to
Right.
the forefront. But for the first 10 questions, I mean, there are things, even divorce can be traumatic.
Oh,
If
right.
one parent is
Divorce. That's
absent
right. Yeah.
by death or divorce. Divorce isn't always, though. Some people manage a divorce and do it in such a way that the
Right.
kids do wonderfully, but it depends on
Right.
how that was leveraged or managed. Do the
Right.
kids have access to both parents? So those are really interesting things that I think it's worth all of us looking at. It's not like we're going to get stuck in it if we acknowledge that some things happened when we were young that
Right.
changed our life, but it may help us understand ourselves better
Oh my
and
God. Yeah.
see if we are looking at life, at friendships, if we're looking at things in a lens that we didn't even know how it was created. And
Exactly.
I
Well,
think for
and
that
that's,
reason.
I mean, the ACE study was mind blowing for me because it was done through Kaiser Permanente and CDC. So it was a totally credible study. And what blew my mind was seeing that if you have 4 or more ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, the chances of you becoming alcoholic go up 700%, like 7 times. And the chances of you suffering with severe obesity go up almost 3 times. The chances of you becoming a smoker go up significantly. And all of these things happened to me. They all came to pass for me. The chances of you doing illicit drugs go up, 300-400%. It was just like looking at, and in my book, I have all of the graphs that show like 0 ACE, 1 ACE, 2 ACE, 3 ACE, 4 ACEs, and the increased percentage. And it's so obvious that trauma, the toxic stress of all these things combined caused trauma. And what was interesting too about the ACE study was it didn't matter which ACEs you had.
Mhm.
Like in other words, sexual abuse and going through being emotionally abused were equal, and not to minimize either one, but were equal, because as far as the brain is concerned, toxic stress is toxic stress. So if you had the experience of sexual abuse and a parents divorcing and emotional and physical neglect versus you had, emotional neglect, parents divorcing, emotional abuse, and a parent having mental illness, you had the same chance of all of these negative health or behavioral outcomes after you become an adult. And so that sort of blows the whole concept of you have to have physical or sexual abuse to experience severe consequences in terms of mental health, physical health, behavioral health as you grow up. And so the first time I saw all of this data, at first it was like, oh my God, I'm so relieved. It's like, again, it was confirming that it wasn't my fault. Anybody that had these amount of ACEs had the chance of, much higher chance of this happening to them too. But then after I kind of took that in, I was like, why couldn't I have been born to more healthy parents? Chances are I would have never struggled with alcohol, food, weight. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Because it's proven. I mean, so it's sort of like I had to feel the anger and feel the grief of the loss of what could have been, And so the thing about my work now is I feel like by sharing my story, not only can I help people that are struggling with food, drugs, alcohol, or relationships, but once people get into recovery, you can stop the chain from, because if you don't get into recovery, you can't help but traumatize your own children, because you're going to be parenting from the lens that you were parented by. And so that's the power of, they say hurt people hurt people. Well, healed people heal people, And so that's why I feel like it's so important for people to understand about trauma. And another section in the book that I feel like is super important is like, so once I started learning about this, I was talking to a lot of my friends and colleagues about it. And I was noticing like, okay, so according to the CDC, like 25% of people grew up with alcoholic parents, and 20% of girls were molested before they were 18. And, these really large numbers. And so I'm talking about this revelation of, oh my God, I realized I have trauma to my friends. And hardly any of them are saying, oh yeah, well, that happened to me too. Or like, it was conspicuous in its absence, how infrequently people would like acknowledge their trauma. And so I started doing a lot of digging as to what's going on with this. Why aren't, I mean, a study happened over 20 years ago and it's still barely getting to be more mainstream today. And I realized that there's a lot of shame and stigma about acknowledging you have trauma, because people will, a lot of men especially, associate it with being weak. Or if you say you experience trauma, you're inadvertently blaming your parents, which is like a huge taboo in our culture. Or, you're saying that that you should have been able to get over it on your own. And it would be like, to me, it would be like getting over trauma, if it truly is trauma, which means that your nervous system has been altered in a way that will stay that way for life unless you get proper treatment. If it would be like expecting somebody with a brain injury to just get over it on their own, because it really is like a form of a brain injury in a sense.
The good news too is that depending on how many positive, because we're doing more, talking more also about what positive
Yes.
effects are during childhood. So if you had one or two adults in your life that, like a coach, a teacher, an aunt, whatever, who appreciated you, who validated you, who believed you,
Absolutely.
or a parent in the home who was not keeping secrets and who
Right.
tried to be supportive, all of that. So there's so many things that help us at times be resilient that we can also talk about. And it's wonderful, but it is important. I think it's important for people to have, as we were doing the introduction, I talked about looking at the ACEs study. Everyone take a look at it. And there are people who absolutely have a very low or no ACE score, and that's beautiful. There are people who have a high ACE score who don't exhibit some of the same things, but then you can stop and say, what were the positive
the positive
and things in my life?
Yeah.
What happened that made this great outcome? And it's wonderful that the information itself isn't damaging. It's the not knowing, I think.
Right. And I think that's another thing that is so important is, before we had the research on the positive childhood experiences and resilience stuff, the ACE study could freak a lot of people out, because it's like, oh my God, I'm screwed. But I include a lot in my a lot of information in my book. In fact, I have the ACE study in it, as well as the positive childhood experiences questionnaire and the resilience survey, so that you can take a look not only at your ACE score, but also the factors that can offset the negative outcomes of it through the positive things. And the other cool thing about that is, for existing parents, they can get more proactive if they are dealing with a really difficult marriage or whatever. If they're aware that positive childhood experiences are going to help their kids, they can, look at implementing that kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean, just I think just the shame and the stigma especially about addiction and obesity. I mean, I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but according to a Pew Research study, 50% of people in our country believe addiction and obesity are a choice. So like we choose to just basically eat or drink ourselves or get, use drugs to the point of almost maybe even dying, and not realizing that the brains of children that are traumatized are very sensitized and susceptible to addiction, especially if there's a family history. So it's a combination of genetics. Like if both your parents or a parent and a grandparent have alcohol or drug issues and you were raised, it's 50% right there, even if you were adopted and grew up in a normal family. But if you have that kind of genetic history and then you add ACEs on top of it, it's a lot higher. And then if a kid starts drinking or using before their brain is fully developed, about 90% of people with substance use disorders develop them before in their adolescence. Like I started drinking when I was 15, 16. So I almost had the perfect storm. I had the genetics, I had the environment, I had the ACEs. And so the thing I want my book to, or just my message to really convey, is that for those that are struggling or have struggled, it's not your fault. You're not alone. You're not bad or broken. You were traumatized, and and that you can heal. And I have a whole section where I talk about the various healing modalities that address the nervous system and the brain and the body, as well as the beliefs, because shame and guilt are such a pervasive issue for those of us with trauma, because it's hard not to believe you're not broken when you continually struggle. And most of the treatments, most therapists don't even recognize that trauma is driving it. And so then you wonder why you can't heal. And so anyway, it's I'm so glad that this topic is getting more coverage, and I'm hoping my story will help with that.
Love it. And where can people connect with you and learn more about your book?
Yes.
And figure out how to work with you?
Yeah. So my book it's not about food, drugs, or alcohol. It's about healing complex PTSD. It's hard to get this without
Excellent.
this. Yeah.
Excellent. For
Anyway,
those on YouTube, she's showing you the cover, but for those of you who aren't, you can look at it on YouTube.
Yeah. It's not about food, drugs, or alcohol. It's about healing complex PTSD.
Great.
Because again, the alcohol, drugs, and food are just the symptom, and the complex PTSD is what is the fire and driving it. It's on Amazon, and it's in Kindle, and it's in paperback, and I'm just getting ready to get the Audible version out there.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. And so is there a website people can
Yes.
connect with you at? Wonderful. Where is it?
It's Mary Giuliani. That's GIULIANI.net.
Excellent.
And I have a free complex PTS quiz on it. So if you want to see if you might have hidden symptoms of complex PTSD, you can check it out. Or I have tons of resources. I'm also a coach if you need help with one-on-one coaching. And I'm also a speaker.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mary, for
You're
being
welcome.
here today.
This has been amazing. I so appreciate it.